Boscombe Down, Wiltshire. The 27th of September, 1964. A grey Sunday afternoon, the sort of damp English weather that turns concrete the colour of gunmetal, and Roland Beaumont is strapping himself into a cockpit that has cost the British taxpayer something north of £125 million. Around him, the airfield is unusually quiet. The ministry has insisted upon it. No press, no cameras beyond the official ones. A handful of engineers from British Aircraft Corporation, a clutch of nervous Air Ministry men in Macintoshes, and a single Royal Air Force liaison officer who has been told, in no uncertain terms, that what is about to happen must not appear in any newspaper the following morning. Beaumont, a Battle of Britain veteran and the finest test pilot of his generation, runs through the checks with the patience of a man who has done this thousands of times and the alertness of a man who knows that today is different. The aircraft beneath him is unlike anything that has ever flown from a British runway. 2 Bristol, Siddeley, Olympus engines, derivatives of the power plants that will, in time, propel Concorde, sit behind him, producing a combined thrust that exceeds the all-up weight of a Lancaster bomber. The airframe is built to skim the Earth at 1,000 feet per second, beneath Soviet radar, and to deliver a nuclear weapon to a target inside the Warsaw Pact, with an accuracy measured not in miles, but in yards. The aircraft is the TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance Mark II. And in Moscow, although no one at Boscombe Down yet knows the full extent of it, there are men in uniform losing sleep over its very existence. The Soviet General Staff has a file on this aeroplane. So does the Glavnoye Razvedivatelnoye Upravlenie, the GRU. So does the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, the KGB. The file is thick. It contains photographs lifted from British aviation journals, snippets of overheard conversation from cocktail parties in South Kensington, and a single, devastatingly accurate set of performance figures obtained, the British later suspected, from a source uncomfortably close to Whitehall itself. What that file tells the Soviet Air Defense Command is straightforward and terrifying. The TSR-2 can fly at Mach 1.1 at 200 feet above the ground. It can cruise at Mach 2.05 at high altitude. It has a combat radius that places Kiev, Minsk, Leningrad, and a string of Soviet airfields and command bunkers comfortably within reach of an aircraft taking off from West Germany. Its terrain-following radar, the most sophisticated avionics suite ever fitted to a combat aircraft west of the Urals, can put it on a target the size of a tennis court in zero visibility at night in a snowstorm. And there is, in 1964, nothing in the Soviet inventory that can stop it. That is the secret Beaumont carries with him as he lines the prototype up on Boscombe Down's main runway. The first taxi trials are complete. The first flight has already taken place in heavy weather. Today is something altogether more important. The day the engineers will push the airframe harder, the day the performance envelope begins to open, the day the figures start to flow back to the men in the Air Ministry who must decide what to tell the Cabinet, what to tell the Americans, and what, above all, they must keep from the Russians. Within 6 months, the aircraft will be cancelled. Within 12, every prototype will be scrapped. And yet, 50 years later, declassified Soviet documents will reveal something extraordinary. The Kremlin had already begun, in secret, to redesign the entire air defense architecture of the Western Soviet Union. The reason was sitting on a Wiltshire runway. Britain in the autumn of 1964 is a country in the middle of a long, slow argument with itself about what it is for. The empire is gone, or going. India has been independent for 17 years. Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, Cyprus, and Malaya have all hauled down the Union Jack. Suez, in 1956, broke something that has never quite been repaired. A confidence, perhaps, or an illusion that Britain could still act as a great power without first asking permission from Washington. Harold Macmillan's Conservative government has crumbled under the weight of the Profumo affair and a series of spy scandals that read, in retrospect, like a particularly lurid Le Carré novel. Sir Alec Douglas Home, the gaunt and aristocratic Foreign Secretary turned Prime Minister, presides over a cabinet that knows, in its bones, that it will lose the coming election. And yet, beneath the political turbulence, there is still a Britain that takes itself seriously as a military and technological power. The Royal Air Force operates the V-bomber force, Valiant, Vulcan, and Victor, the airborne component of an independent nuclear deterrent that has been British policy since Attlee's secret cabinet decision in January 1947. The Royal Navy still fields aircraft carriers, fleet submarines, and a global presence east of Suez. The British aviation industry, although consolidated into two great groups, remains one of the most advanced in the world. De Havilland built the first jet airliner. Hawker built the Hunter. English Electric built the Canberra, an aircraft so good the Americans bought it under license. And in late 1964, British Aircraft Corporation, the merged successor to Vickers and English Electric, is building the TSR-2. The TSR-2 program has its origins in a 1957 operational requirement GOR.339, drafted by the Air Staff in the wake of Duncan Sandys' notorious defence white paper of that year. Sandys, Churchill's son-in-law and Macmillan's defence minister, had declared that manned aircraft were obsolete and that the future of British air power lay in guided missiles. It was a position that horrified the RAF, dismayed the aviation industry, and proved within 3 years to be catastrophically wrong. By 1959, the Air Staff had quietly persuaded the Cabinet that a manned low-level strike aircraft was, in fact, essential. A replacement for the aging Canberra, capable of nuclear and conventional strike, reconnaissance, and the sort of deep penetration mission that no V-bomber could realistically attempt in the radar-saturated airspace of Central Europe. The strategic logic was sound. By the early 1960s, the Soviet Union had deployed the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile, the SA-2 guideline in NATO parlance, in such density across the Warsaw Pact that high-altitude penetration by a V-bomber had become, in the cold language of the Joint Intelligence Committee, unviable in the contested air environment. Gary Power's U-2 had been shot down in May 1960 at 70,000 feet. The lesson was learned in Whitehall before the Americans had finished writing their press releases. If British bombers were to reach Soviet targets, they would have to do so beneath the radar, not above it. Low level, high speed, all weather. That meant a new aircraft. That meant the TSR-2. The Air Staff specification was, by any standard, extraordinary. Mach 2 at altitude, Mach 1.1 at 200 feet, a combat radius of 1,000 nautical miles on internal fuel, operation from rough strips, terrain following radar, a bomb load including the British-designed Redbeard nuclear weapon. No aircraft in the world in 1959 came close. The Americans were working on something similar, the F-111. But they were behind, and they knew it. The Russians had nothing comparable, even on the drawing board. The men who built the TSR-2 were, in many cases, the same men who had built the aircraft that won the Battle of Britain and bombed the Ruhr. Sir George Edwards, chairman of British Aircraft Corporation, had been chief designer at Vickers since the war. He had overseen the Viscount, the Valiant, and the VC-10. He was a Surrey carpenter's son who had risen by sheer engineering brilliance. And he understood, perhaps better than any other man in Britain, what the TSR-2 represented. The last chance for the British aviation industry to remain a first-rank world power. Beside him stood Freddie Page at English Electric, the designer of the Lightning Interceptor, an aeroplane so fast that, when it first appeared at Farnborough, the Soviet air attaché had to be physically restrained from running onto the tarmac to photograph it. At the political level, the patron of the program was Peter Thornycroft, Minister of Aviation and later Defence Secretary, a conservative who genuinely believed that an independent British strategic capability was worth fighting for inside cabinet. Opposing him, with quiet but immense influence, was Denis Healey. At this stage still in opposition, but a man whose forensic intellect and ferocious appetite for cost analysis would, within a year, become decisive. The Royal Air Force project officer was Air Vice Marshal Sir Christopher Hartley, a phlegmatic intelligence specialist with a deep understanding of what Soviet air defense actually looked like from inside a Canberra cockpit. Hartley had flown reconnaissance missions over the Baltic in the 1950s. He knew, in a way that politicians did not, exactly how thin the survival margins had become for high-altitude British aircraft. He wanted the TSR-2, and he wanted it badly. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the men who would have to defend against this aircraft were, in their own way, equally formidable. Marshal Pavel Batitsky commanded the Wojska Protivozdushnoi Obrony, the PVO Strany, the air defense forces of the Soviet Union. Batitsky was a Stalingrad veteran who had personally shot Lavrenti Beria in the cellars of the Lubyanka in 1953 on Khrushchev's orders. He was not a man easily frightened, but the British aircraft frightened him. The intelligence reports landing on his desk through 1963 and 1964, channeled from the GRU's London Residentura and from sympathetic sources inside the French aviation industry, painted a picture of a weapon system that the existing Soviet air defense belt, built around the SA-2 and its high-altitude radar network, simply could not engage. The problem was geometry. The SA-2 was designed to kill aircraft at altitude. Its radar horizon, its missile flight envelope, its engagement logic, all of it assumed targets at 20,000 feet and above. An aircraft skimming the deck at 200 feet, traveling faster than the speed of sound, would appear on Soviet radar, if it appeared at all, for perhaps 15 seconds before reaching the target. That was not enough time to acquire, lock, launch, and guide. It was barely enough time to issue a warning. Batitsky's staff began, in the spring of 1964, to commission a wholesale reassessment of Soviet air defense doctrine. New radars would be required, radars that could see down, not up. New missiles would be needed, with shorter reaction times and the capability to engage targets below 500 feet. New command and control architecture would have to be built, decentralized enough to allow individual battery commanders to engage without waiting for permission from Moscow. The eventual fruits of this work, the S-125 Neva, the S-300 family, and the entire low-level interceptor doctrine that would humiliate the Israeli Air Force in 1973, all trace, in their conceptual origins, to a single British aircraft program that the Russians believed, with perfect seriousness, was about to be deployed against them. The first flight of the TSR-2 took place on the 27th of September 1964, with Roland Beaumont at the controls and Donald Bowen as his navigator. It was not a triumph. The undercarriage refused to retract. One of the Olympus engines ran rough. The flight lasted barely 14 minutes and ended with a landing in which the aircraft shuddered violently as the gear came down at the wrong angle. Beaumont, characteristically, climbed out smiling and told the assembled engineers that the aircraft flew beautifully, considering. What followed, over the next 4 months, was a test program that revealed, piece by piece, an aircraft of extraordinary capability and a political environment of extraordinary hostility. By the 24th flight, Beaumont was reporting that the TSR-2 was the most stable and predictable aircraft he had ever flown at low level. By the 10th flight, he had taken it supersonic, on one engine, with the reheat malfunctioning, climbing through 30,000 feet over the Salisbury Plain. He later said, in a remark that has since become famous in British aviation circles, that the TSR-2 was the only aircraft he had ever flown that gave the impression of being capable of doing more than its designers had asked of it. But in Westminster, the politics were turning poisonous. The 1964 general election, held on the 15th of October, just 18 days after the TSR-2's first flight, returned a Labour government with a majority of 4. Harold Wilson became Prime Minister. Denis Healey became Secretary of State for Defence. And the TSR-2, which had survived 18 separate attempts at cancellation under successive Conservative governments, suddenly faced a political environment in which its survival was, at best, a matter of cold, actuarial calculation. Healey was not, contrary to later mythology, ideologically opposed to the TSR-2. He understood the strategic case for low-level strike. What he objected to was the cost. The original Treasury estimate in 1959 had been £90 million for the development phase. By the end of 1964, that figure had risen to £270 million, with production unit costs projected at £4 million per airframe, roughly 4 times the cost of a comparable American aircraft. The program had become, in the brutal phrase used by one Treasury official to the Cabinet Defence Committee, a Rolls-Royce of an aeroplane in a year of Morris Minor budgets. What Healey did not yet know, what the Joint Intelligence Committee would not formally report until February 1965, was that the Americans had, through their own diplomatic and intelligence channels, begun a quiet campaign to kill the TSR-2 and replace it with the American F-111. The motive was partly commercial. Lockheed and General Dynamics wanted the British market. But it was also strategic. A Britain that built its own top-line strike aircraft was a Britain that could, in extremis, act independently. A Britain that bought its strike aircraft from the United States was a Britain bound by spare parts and software dependencies into the American alliance system in perpetuity. The cable from the British Embassy in Washington, dated the 19th of January 1965, was unequivocal. The American offer was generous. The F-111K, a British variant of the F-111A, would be supplied at a fixed unit price of £2.25 million. Delivery would begin in 1968. Healey would later describe the offer, in his memoirs, as almost too good to be true, which, of course, was precisely the problem. By the end of January, the Cabinet Defence and Overseas Policy Committee had begun, in conditions of the strictest secrecy, to consider the cancellation of the TSR-2. The men in Moscow, watching all this through their own intelligence channels, could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The decision was taken at a cabinet meeting held at number 10 Downing Street on the morning of Thursday, the 1st of April, 1965. There is, in the surviving cabinet minutes, released to the National Archives at Kew under the 30-year rule in 1995, a quiet, almost banal quality to the discussion. Healey opened. He set out the costs. He explained the American offer. He observed, with the careful neutrality of a barrister presenting a brief, that the TSR-2 represented a capability we cannot afford and an aircraft we cannot fly in the numbers required to justify its development. George Brown, the first Secretary of State and a man who detested Healey on personal grounds almost as much as he detested the Treasury on principle, fought a brief rearguard action. He pointed out that cancellation would destroy thousands of skilled engineering jobs in the West Midlands and Lancashire. He warned that the political damage in marginal constituencies would be severe. He suggested, with characteristic bluntness, that buying American aircraft was a form of national castration. But the numbers were against him. Wilson, who had spent his career as an economist and who understood Treasury arithmetic better than any Prime Minister since Gladstone, summed up. The TSR-2 would be cancelled. The F-111K would be ordered in its place. The announcement would be made by the Chancellor, James Callaghan, in his budget speech the following Tuesday. On the afternoon of Tuesday, the 6th of April, Callaghan rose in the House of Commons to deliver his budget. The chamber was packed, the press gallery was full, and somewhere in the middle of a long passage on capital expenditure, almost as if he were embarrassed by what he had to say, the Chancellor delivered the sentence that ended the British aviation industry's hopes of remaining a first-rank power. The government has decided not to proceed with the development of the TSR-2 aircraft. There was a moment of silence. Then, uproar. At Wisley Airfield in Surrey, where the second prototype was being readied for its next test flight, the news came through on the BBC's lunchtime bulletin. Roland Beaumont, who had been about to climb into the cockpit, listened in silence. He turned to his ground crew, took off his flying helmet, and said, in a phrase that has since passed into RAF folklore, "Well, that's that then." The aircraft did not fly that afternoon. It never flew again. At Wharton, at Weybridge, at Filton, at every BAC plant where TSR-2 components were being built, work stopped within 24 hours. The Ministry of Aviation issued instructions that all jigs, tooling, technical drawings, and partially completed airframes were to be destroyed. The instruction was carried out with a thoroughness that has, ever since, attracted the suspicion of conspiracy theorists. The 5 completed airframes, XR219, XR220, XR221, XR222, and XR223 were broken up at Wharton. The fuselages were used as gunnery targets at Shoeburyness. Only 2 aircraft survived, XR220, now at the RAF Museum at Cosford, and XR222 at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. Every drawing, every blueprint, every piece of technical documentation was pulped or burned. Why? The official explanation was that the destruction was necessary to prevent the Treasury from being lobbied to revive the program. The unofficial explanation, whispered for decades in aviation circles and now substantially confirmed by declassified documents at Kew, was that the Americans had insisted upon it. The F-111K contract was conditional on the complete and verifiable destruction of the British alternative. The Cabinet, having taken the decision, had no choice but to comply. In Moscow, the intelligence officers who had been losing sleep over the TSR-2 received the news with a mixture of disbelief and quiet, professional satisfaction. The cost was incalculable, and it began to be paid almost immediately. The most obvious losses were industrial. By the end of 1965, British Aircraft Corporation had shed 8,000 skilled engineering jobs across its plants in Lancashire, the West Midlands, and the South West. English Electric's aviation division at Wharton, which had employed nearly 15,000 people at the height of the programme, was reduced within 18 months to a maintenance and modification operation. The supply chain, the small precision engineering firms in the Black Country, the avionics specialists in Crawley and Stevenage, the metallurgical laboratories at Sheffield and Birmingham, withered with extraordinary speed. The men in those workshops did not, on the whole, find comparable work. Many emigrated. A surprising number, recruited quietly by the Americans, ended up at Lockheed Burbank, Boeing Seattle, and Grumman Long Island, where their skills helped to build the very aircraft that were now sold back to Britain at a profit. The political fallout was, if anything, worse. The F-111K contract turned out to be precisely the trap that George Brown had feared. By the autumn of 1967, with the pound under intense pressure on the foreign exchange markets and the Wilson government staggering towards the devaluation crisis of November that year, the cost of the F-111K had escalated from the original £2.25 million per aircraft to nearly £3 million. The total programme cost, originally projected at £400 million, was now heading towards £600. On the 16th of January 1968, in a cabinet decision taken under conditions of severe financial emergency, the F-111K order was itself cancelled. Britain had now paid for 2 strike aircraft programmes and received neither. The Royal Air Force would, in the end, soldier on with the obsolescent Canberra and the Vulcan until the arrival of the Anglo-French Jaguar in 1973 and, eventually, the Panavia Tornado in 1980, both of which were, in essence, attempts to recapture, through international collaboration, the capability that the TSR-2 had been on the point of delivering alone. The intelligence cost was subtler, but, in the long view, more damaging. The Joint Intelligence Committee's annual review for 1966, declassified at Kew in 1997, contains a remarkable passage in which the JIC notes, with evident discomfort, that the Soviet air defense reorganization triggered by the TSR-2 program had not been reversed by the aircraft's cancellation. On the contrary, the Russians, having committed substantial resources to developing low-level radar coverage and short-reaction interceptor missiles, were now proceeding with that program regardless. The strategic threat that had justified the TSR-2 was, in other words, now being addressed by a Soviet defense architecture specifically designed to defeat the aircraft Britain had decided not to build. The RAF would, for the next decade, face a Soviet air defense system that was harder to penetrate than the one it had faced in 1964. There was, finally, a moral cost. Although that is a word the Defence Ministry of the period did not use, the TSR-2 had been a national project in a way that very few defence programmes since have been. It had drawn on the talents of the British engineering classes, the grammar school boys who had risen through technical colleges into the design offices of Vickers and English Electric, in a manner that the country has struggled, ever since, to replicate. When the programme died, something of that confidence died with it. The British aviation industry would never again attempt, alone, to build a world-beating military aircraft. The skills, the institutions, the self-belief, all of it gradually dispersed. The TSR-2 was the last of its kind, and everyone who worked on it knew it. The immediate aftermath was, for Harold Wilson's government, a period of intense political pain, followed by a long, slow recalibration of British defence policy that lasted, in its essentials, until the end of the Cold War. The 1966 Defence Review, presented by Healey to the House of Commons in February of that year, formally accepted that Britain could no longer afford a global military posture. The withdrawal from east of Suez, announced in stages between 1967 and 1971, was the direct consequence. British forces left Aden, Singapore, Malaysia, and the Gulf. The Royal Navy's aircraft carriers, the CVA-01 program, intended as the maritime equivalent of the TSR-2, were cancelled in the same defence review. The Royal Air Force was reduced in size by nearly a third over the following decade. The Empire's last serious military pretensions were quietly buried. In Moscow, the response was at first one of bewildered relief, and then, more characteristically, of cold strategic calculation. The KGB's first chief directorate, in a report to the Politburo dated July 1965, observed with evident satisfaction that the British have unilaterally disarmed in a category of strategic weapons that we had assessed as posing our most serious immediate threat. But the Soviet General Staff did not believe in unilateral British disarmament. They believed in British cunning. The assumption in the Kremlin, well into the 1970s, was that the TSR-2 had not really been cancelled at all, that the program had simply gone underground, that some variant of the aircraft was still being developed in secret, perhaps under American cover at the Skunk Works at Burbank, or at the British research establishment at Boscombe Down. The PVO Strani continued, on this assumption, to invest heavily in low-level air defence. The S-125, the S-200, the S-300, and the entire Soviet doctrine of layered, integrated, low-altitude air defence that culminated in the systems deployed today across Russia and its neighbours. All of it grew out of a threat assessment that had been formed by an aircraft that in fact no longer existed. The special relationship with the United States was, in the short term, strengthened. Wilson's government had, in cancelling the TSR-2 and ordering the F-111K, made a fundamental choice in favour of strategic dependency on Washington. That choice was reinforced by the Polaris submarine program, which delivered Britain's nuclear deterrent into American hands in a way that had no equivalent in the V-bomber era. By the time Edward Heath came to power in 1970, the question of British strategic independence in conventional aviation had effectively been settled. Britain would, henceforth, build aircraft in collaboration with the French, the Germans, the Italians, and the Americans, but never again entirely alone. The aviation industry itself was reorganized by the Wilson and Heath governments into the configuration that survived, with modifications, until the end of the century. British Aircraft Corporation, Hawker Siddeley, and Scottish Aviation were merged in 1977 into the nationalised British Aerospace. The Filton site, where the TSR-2's Olympus engines had been developed, was redirected into Concorde and eventually into Airbus. The Wharton site, where the prototypes had been built, became the home of the Tornado and later the Eurofighter Typhoon. The skills were not entirely lost, but they were dispersed, redirected, and made dependent on European partnerships in a way that the men who had built the TSR-2 would not have recognized. And the aircraft itself? 2 airframes survived, mute and slightly forlorn, in museums at Cosford and Duxford. Generations of British schoolboys would visit them, walk around them, marvel at the elegance of the design, and ask the question that has hung over the programme ever since. What if? What if? It is the question that haunts every account of the TSR-2, and there is no honest answer to it. The aircraft never entered service. The Royal Air Force never flew it operationally. We can never know, with certainty, whether the TSR-2 would have lived up to the extraordinary claims made for it by its designers and test pilots, or whether, like so many advanced weapons programs, it would have run into difficulties that the prototype trials had not yet revealed. Sir Sidney Cam, the great Hawker designer, once observed that all modern aircraft have 4 dimensions: span, length, height, and politics. The TSR-2 was killed by the 4th dimension before the first 3 could be properly tested. And yet the legacy is real, and it is more interesting than the simple counterfactual question allows. The TSR-2 changed the world without ever entering service. It forced the Soviet Union to redesign its air defenses. It accelerated the Russian development of low-level radar and short-reaction surface-to-air missiles by perhaps a decade. The S-300 system that today protects Russian airspace, the S-400 that has been sold to China and Turkey, the entire architecture of modern integrated air defense, all of it bears the genetic trace of a Soviet response to a British aircraft that flew only 24 times. There is a peculiar British irony in that. The aircraft that the cabinet judged too expensive to build became, by its mere existence, one of the most consequential influences on Soviet military doctrine in the entire Cold War. The TSR-2 also changed Britain. It marked the moment at which the country accepted, finally and almost unconsciously, that it would no longer build the most advanced military aircraft in the world alone. Every British combat aircraft since 1965, the Jaguar, the Harrier in its later variants, the Tornado, the Typhoon, and now the Tempest program, has been a collaboration. The model of the lone British design office producing a world beater, which had run unbroken from the Sopwith Camel through the Spitfire and the Hunter and the Lightning, ended on a Wiltshire runway on the morning the cancellation was announced. Whether that was a wise adaptation to economic reality or a national surrender of ambition is an argument that has run in the pages of military journals and aviation magazines for 60 years and shows no sign of ending. What does the episode tell us about Britain's role in the world? Perhaps this, that the country has, throughout the post-war period, repeatedly faced a choice between strategic ambition and economic prudence, and has, almost without exception, chosen prudence. The TSR-2 was cancelled for honest reasons. The Treasury figures were not invented. The cost overruns were real. Healey was not wrong to worry about them. But the decision was made without a full understanding of what was being given up. Not merely an aircraft, but an entire industrial and intellectual ecosystem, an entire conception of what kind of country Britain intended to be. The men in the cabinet on that April morning in 1965 thought they were cancelling an aeroplane. They were, in fact, cancelling something larger. That is the question I want to leave you with. Was the cancellation of the TSR-2 the correct, prudent decision of a country adjusting realistically to its diminished circumstances? Or was it a moment of strategic short-sightedness from which British defence has never fully recovered? Let me know in the comments below. I read them all, and I'm particularly interested to hear from anyone with family who worked on the programme. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history of British defence, intelligence, and the Cold War. Until next time.